an island off the northwest coast of Europe, separated from the continent by a channel of water, narrow enough to see across on a clear day. This geography shapes everything that follows, because an island that cannot easily be invaded must find other ways to project power. And an island people who master the sea have access to the entire world. Britain in the 16th century is not yet a great power. It is a medium-sized kingdom on the edge of Europe, recently unified under the Tudor dynasty, recovering from a century of civil war, emerging from the religious upheaval of the Reformation. Spain and Portugal are the powers that matter in the wider world. They have divided the oceans between them by papal decree and are extracting enormous wealth from the Americas and the trading routes of Africa and Asia. England looks at this and begins to move, not yet with armies and colonies, first with explorers and merchants. John Cabot sails to North America in 1497, just 5 years after Columbus. Francis Drake circumnavigates the globe between 1577 and 1580. Walter Raleigh attempts the first English settlement in North America at Roanoke in 1585. It disappears without explanation. The colony that will survive must wait until the next century. The decisive moment that opens the way for British expansion comes in 1588. The Spanish Armada. Philip II of Spain sends a fleet of 130 ships to carry an invasion force to England. The plan is to overthrow Elizabeth I, reimpose Catholicism, and bring England back under Spanish influence. The Armada is defeated not primarily by English ships, though the English fight effectively, but by storms that scatter and destroy the fleet as it tries to return around Scotland and Ireland. Of the 130 ships that set out, perhaps 67 returned to Spain. The defeat does not destroy Spanish power immediately, but it demonstrates that Spain is not invincible and that England can defend itself. What follows over the next century is the slow, contested, and often brutal process by which England, and then after the union of England and Scotland in 1707, Britain establishes itself as a maritime power capable of competing with France, Spain, and the Netherlands for control of trade routes, colonies, and the wealth that flows from both. The tools of empire building in this period are not primarily armies, they are chartered companies. The East India Company, founded in 1600, the Virginia Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, private enterprises granted monopolies by the Crown to trade in specific regions. They carry the flag, but they carry their own interests first. The distinction between commerce and conquest will remain blurred throughout the history of the empire. Rest now. The island is small and the ocean is vast, but the people on that island are about to go further than any island people have gone before. Good night. Good night. Before Britain looks across the oceans, it looks closer to home Ireland, the island, to the West English involvement in Ireland. Begins in the 12th century, but it is in the 16th and 17th centuries that it takes on the character that will define the relationship for centuries to come. The plantation of Ulster in the early 17th century is the most significant of these interventions, Scottish and English. Protestant settlers are brought to the northern province of Ireland, displacing the Catholic Gaelic population from their lands. The settlement is systematic and deliberate. It creates a divided society whose tensions will persist for 400 years, the conflict between communities. In Northern Ireland in the 20th century, the Troubles has its roots in decisions made in the early 1600s. Across the Atlantic, the first permanent English settlement in North America is established at Jamestown in Virginia in 1607. It nearly fails. The settlers are unprepared for the conditions. Disease, starvation, and conflict with local peoples kill the majority in the first years. The colony survives partly through sheer stubbornness and partly through the cultivation of tobacco, which finds a ready market in England and makes Virginia economically viable. In 1620, a different kind of settler arrives in North America. The Pilgrim Fathers, a group of Protestant separatists who have left England for religious freedom, land at Plymouth in Massachusetts. They are not the first English settlers, and they are not the most economically significant. But their story becomes foundational to American national mythology in ways that shape how Americans understand their own origins for centuries. Through the 17th century, English settlements spread along the eastern coast of North America: Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maryland, Carolina, Pennsylvania. Each colony has its own character, its own religious and social composition, its own relationship with the indigenous peoples of the region. What they share is a connection to England, a dependence on English trade, and an increasing sense of their own distinct identity. The indigenous peoples of North America face a catastrophe that unfolds over generations: disease brought by Europeans, to which indigenous populations have no immunity, kills enormous numbers before sustained contact even begins. Then comes displacement, land seizure, conflict, and the destruction of ways of life that have existed for thousands of years. The English settlers do not regard this as a crime. They regard the land as available, either because it appears unfarmed in the European sense, or because they have purchased it in transactions whose terms the sellers do not understand in the same way the buyers do. The colonies grow, they become prosperous. They develop their own institutions and their own sense of how they should be governed. The relationship with the mother country becomes more complex as the colonies mature, and their interests begin to diverge from those of London. Rest now, the Atlantic is dark and wide. Tonight, on both sides of it, people are building something whose full shape neither can yet see. Good night. Good night. 1600, Queen Elizabeth I grants a royal charter to a group of London merchants. They are given a monopoly on English trade with the East Indies, the lands beyond the Cape of Good Hope to the east and Cape Horn to the west. The organization they form is called the East India Company. It begins as a trading enterprise. It ends as the ruler of the Indian subcontinent. The distance between those 2 points is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of commerce and empire. In its early decades, the company competes with the Portuguese and the Dutch for access to the spice trade of Southeast Asia. It establishes trading posts in India almost as an afterthought, a secondary market. while it pursues the more lucrative spices of the Indonesian archipelago. The first trading post in India is established at Surat in 1613. Others follow at Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. India in this period is dominated by the Mughal Empire, one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated states in the world. The company's early representatives are supplicants at the Mughal court, requesting permission to trade, offering gifts, trying to establish the commercial relationships that will make their shareholders rich. The idea that this company might one day rule India would have struck the Mughal emperors as absurd. The shift begins in the 18th century. The Mughal Empire weakens, regional powers emerge across the subcontinent. The company, which has been building a private army to protect its trading posts, finds itself drawn into the conflicts between these powers. It allies with some against others. It fights, it wins, and with each victory, it acquires territory, revenue, and influence that make it more powerful than any purely commercial enterprise has any right to be. The pivotal moment is the Battle of Plassey. In 1757, Robert Clive, a company officer of exceptional ambition and questionable ethics, defeats the Nawab of Bengal through a combination of military force and the betrayal of the Nawab's own commander, who has been bribed in advance. Bengal, the richest province in India, passes under company control. The revenue it generates funds further expansion. The company governs Bengal not as a colony in the formal sense, but as a commercial operation. It extracts revenue, controls trade, and administers justice according to its own interests. The results for the population of Bengal are devastating. A famine in 1707 kills between 1 and 10 million people. The estimates varying widely, while the company continues to collect taxes from a population that cannot feed itself. In London, the scale of what the company is doing eventually forces parliamentary attention. A series of India Acts in the late 18th century begin to bring the company under government supervision. But the basic structure, a private company exercising sovereign power over millions of people, remains in place for another century. Rest now, India is vast and ancient tonight. A trading company from a small island is becoming something no one planned and no one fully controls. Good night. Good night.
For most of the 17th and 18th centuries, the central fact of British foreign policy is France. The two countries fight each other repeatedly across Europe and across the world in a rivalry that shapes the British Empire as much as any internal decision. Because every time Britain fights France, it is also fighting for control of trade routes, colonies, and the wealth that flows from global commerce. France is Britain's equal or superior in almost every conventional measure of power. For most of this period, its population is 3 times larger, its army is the finest. In Europe, its culture dominates the continent. Its colonial ambitions are as extensive as Britain's, with territories in North America, the Caribbean, India, and West Africa. The wars between them are numerous and expensive. The War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War. Each one is fought not just on European battlefields, but in India, in North America, in the Caribbean, and on the oceans between. They are world wars in every meaningful sense before the term exists. The The 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1753, is the most consequential Britain. Under the leadership of William Pitt the Elder pursues a global strategy, using naval power to cut France off from its colonies while subsidizing Prussia to fight the land war in Europe. The results are transformative in North America. Britain takes Canada from France. In India, Robert Clive's victories and the broader defeat of French influence leave Britain dominant. On the subcontinent in the Caribbean, Britain takes several valuable sugar islands. The Treaty of Paris in 1753 that ends the 7 Years' War represents the moment Britain becomes the world's leading colonial power. It controls the seas, it controls the most valuable trading routes. Its navy is larger and more capable than any rival. The empire that emerges from this war is the foundation on which everything that follows is built. But the cost of these wars is enormous. Britain's national debt has grown dramatically. The government in London looks at its North American colonies, which have benefited from British military protection during the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, and decides they should contribute to the cost of their own defense. It begins imposing taxes. The colonies object. They have grown used to governing themselves, and they dispute Parliament's right to tax them without their representation in it. The argument that begins over tax will end in revolution. Britain defeats France in the great global contest of the 18th century, and then almost immediately faces a crisis in its most developed and prosperous colonies. Victory and crisis arrive together, as they often do in the history of empires. Rest now, the oceans are British tonight, but across the Atlantic something is stirring that no one in London has fully understood. Good night. Good night.
(1753 to 1776), 13 years between the end of the 7 Years' War and the American Declaration of Independence, 13 years in which Britain and its American colonies move from tension to confrontation to revolution. The process is not inevitable at the start. It becomes so through a series of decisions made in London that consistently misread the situation and underestimate the strength of colonial feeling. The core dispute is not really about tax. The amounts involved are relatively small. It is about principle and about power. The colonists have developed their own assemblies, their own legal traditions, their own sense of political identity over a century and a half. They do not consider themselves subjects to be taxed by a parliament in which they have no voice. They consider themselves Englishmen. With the rights of Englishmen, no taxation without representation is not a revolutionary slogan. It is a statement of what they believe they are already entitled to. Parliament sees it differently. The colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country. They receive British protection and British trade, and they should pay for it. Each side is applying a coherent logic to the same situation and reaching incompatible conclusions. The Stamp Act of 1765 provokes the first serious organized resistance. It is repealed but replaced with other measures. The Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, the Boston Massacre in 1717, where British soldiers fire into a crowd and kill 5 people. The Boston Tea Party in 1773, where colonists dump an entire cargo of East India Company
tea into the harbor rather than pay the tax on it. Britain responds to Boston with the coercive acts, closing the port and restricting self-government in Massachusetts. The other colonies, rather than seeing Massachusetts isolated and punished, rally to its support. The First Continental Congress meets in 1774. Armed conflict begins in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord when British troops march to seize colonial weapon stores and are met by armed militiamen. On the 4th of July 1706, the Continental Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence. 13 colonies declare themselves a new nation. The arguments they use draw heavily on Enlightenment, philosophy, on Locke, and on the English tradition of rights going back to Magna Carta. They are, in a very real sense, using British political ideas to justify independence from Britain. The war that follows lasts 8 years. Britain has the professional army, and the Navy, the Americans of motivation, local knowledge, the leadership of George Washington, and eventually French military support. France, seeing the opportunity to wound its great rival, enters the war on the American side. The French Navy proves decisive at Yorktown in 1781. The British Army is trapped by French ships and American and French ground forces and forced to surrender. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognizes American independence. Britain loses its most populous and prosperous colonies. It is a significant blow, but the empire does not collapse. It adapts. It turns its attention elsewhere, to India, to the Pacific, to Africa. Rest now, America is gone, but the empire is already looking for what comes next. Good night.
While Britain loses America in the West, it is consolidating and expanding in the East India, the subcontinent that the East India Company has been penetrating. Since the early 17th century is becoming something far more than a trading partner. It is becoming the center of gravity of the entire British Empire. By the late 18th century, the company controls Bengal, the richest province, and is expanding in every direction. Its wars with the Maratha Confederacy, with Tipu, Sultan of Mysore, and with the Sikh kingdom of the Punjab are fought over decades. Each conflict ends with more territory, more revenue, and more subjects under company control. The final pieces fall into place in the first half of the 19th century. The Third Anglo-Maratha War in 1818 ends the last major Indian power capable of seriously contesting British dominance. The conquest of Sindh in 1843 and the Punjab in 1849, after two hard-fought Anglo-Sikh wars, complete the territorial picture. Britain now controls virtually the entire Indian subcontinent directly or through treaties with nominally independent princely states. The administration that emerges is a complex mixture of direct British rule and indirect control through local rulers who retain their thrones in exchange for accepting British authority. The Indian civil service, staffed almost entirely by British men, selected through competitive examination, governs the directly administered territories. It is remarkably small for the scale of what it controls. At its peak, a few thousand British civil servants administer a population of hundreds of millions. The economic relationship between Britain and India is deeply contested and remains so among historians. Britain builds railways across India
thousands of kilometers of track that transform the movement of goods and people. It builds telegraph networks, irrigation systems, ports and courts. These are genuine developments that have lasting effects. They are also built primarily to serve British commercial and military interests, to move Indian raw materials to ports and British manufactured goods into Indian markets. Indian industries that compete with British manufacturers are disadvantaged through tariff policies that favor British exports. The wealth that flows from India to Britain over 2 centuries is enormous. Economists have attempted to calculate it and reach figures in the trillions of dollars in modern terms. The figures are disputed, but the direction of the flow is not. In 1857, the relationship is shaken to its foundations. The Indian Rebellion, called the Indian Mutiny by the British, and the First War of Independence by many Indians, begins among Indian soldiers in the company's army and spreads to become a widespread civilian uprising across northern India. It is suppressed with great violence after more than a year of fighting. The consequences are profound. The East India Company is dissolved. The British Crown takes direct control of India. Queen Victoria is eventually proclaimed Empress of India in 1876. The relationship between Britain and India has become something permanent and formal. It will last until 1947. Rest now, India is vast and complex tonight. A few thousand men from a small island are governing hundreds of millions of people and trying to understand what they have taken on. Good night. Good night.
No account of the British Empire can avoid this subject. The transatlantic slave trade is one of the largest forced migrations in human history, and Britain is at its center. For over 2 centuries, it is a chapter that requires careful and honest treatment because its consequences are still present in the world today. The transatlantic slave trade operates on a triangular route. British ships carry manufactured goods to the west coast of Africa. There they trade these goods for enslaved people captured in raids or wars by African kingdoms and sold to European merchants on the coast. The ships then carry their human cargo across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, to the colonies of the Caribbean and North America there. The enslaved people are sold and the ships return to Britain loaded with sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other colonial products. The Middle Passage is one of the most horrific journeys in recorded history. Enslaved people are packed into the holds of ships in conditions that cause enormous suffering, and death estimates suggest that between 10 and 15% of those who began the Middle Passage died before reaching the Americas. Over the entire history of the trade, an estimated 12 million people are transported from Africa. Perhaps 1.5 million die on the crossing. Britain becomes the dominant slaving nation by the 18th century. The city of Bristol and then Liverpool grow wealthy, and the trade. London's financial system is deeply intertwined with it. The sugar islands of the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, and others generate enormous wealth for British planters and merchants. The profitability of slavery funds investment in Britain's Industrial Revolution, according to some historians, though the precise extent of this relationship is still debated. The movement to abolish the slave trade begins in Britain in the late 18th century.
It is one of the first mass political campaigns in British history. Quakers and evangelical Christians lead it, figures like William Wilberforce carry it into Parliament, formerly enslaved. People like Oloda Equiano give it a human voice, publishing accounts of their experiences that make the abstract reality of slavery impossible for readers to ignore. The Slave Trade Act of 1807 abolishes the British slave trade. British ships are no longer permitted to carry enslaved people. The Royal Navy enforces this with patrols off the African coast, intercepting slaving ships of all nations. But slavery itself, the ownership of enslaved people in British colonies, continues for another 26 years. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 ends slavery in most of the British Empire. When it passes, the British government pays £20 million in compensation. The compensation goes to the slave owners, not to the enslaved people. This fact, largely forgotten for generations, has been documented in recent years and speaks to how the system understood property and human rights at the time. Rest now. This is a difficult chapter to sit with. It asks us to hold together the complexity of an empire that produced abolition and also produced the system that required abolishing. Good night. Good night.
1768. The British Admiralty sends a ship called the Endeavour on a scientific expedition to the Pacific. Its commander is James Cook, a Yorkshire-born sailor. Of exceptional navigational skill and methodical intelligence, his official mission is to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti. His secret orders are to search for the great southern continent that geographers have long theorized must exist to balance the land masses of the northern hemisphere. Cook finds no great balancing continent. He finds something else, the eastern coast of a land that Europeans have known about in a vague sense for over a century, but never properly explored. He charts the coastline with remarkable accuracy, lands at a place he names Botany Bay, and claims the land for Britain. He calls it New South Wales. The land already has a name in the languages of the people who live there. It has had many names for at least 50,000 years. Cook does not record them. The indigenous peoples of Australia, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, have lived on the continent for longer than any other human population has lived anywhere outside Africa. Their cultures, languages, and relationships with the land are extraordinarily diverse and sophisticated, adapted over 50 millennia to every environment the continent offers. British settlement begins in 1788. The first fleet of 11 ships carries over 1,000 people to Botany Bay. The majority are convicts, men and women, transported from Britain for crimes ranging from serious offenses to petty theft. The colony at Sydney Cove is a penal settlement, a place to send those Britain's prisons cannot hold. Over the following decades, around 160,000 convicts are transported to Australia. The consequences for Aboriginal peoples are catastrophic and follow the same pattern seen in other parts of the empire. Disease kills enormous numbers before sustained violent conflict begins. Smallpox reaches the Sydney area before British settlers do, spreading inland along existing trade routes and killing populations that have never been exposed to it. Then come dispossession, violence, displacement from lands that have sustained communities for generations, and the systematic destruction of cultures and languages through policies of forced assimilation.
New Zealand follows a somewhat different path. The Maori people of New Zealand engage with British settlers in a more sustained negotiated process. The Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, signed between the British Crown and many Maori chiefs, is presented as a partnership. The English and Maori versions of the treaty differ significantly in what they actually say about sovereignty and land rights. These differences become the source of conflict that continues into the present. Cook makes 3 voyages in total. He maps the Pacific with a comprehensiveness that transforms European understanding of the ocean. He's killed in Hawaii in 1717 in a confrontation with local people over a stolen boat. He is 50 years old. The voyages he makes open the Pacific to British commercial and colonial expansion in ways that reshape the entire ocean. Rest now. The Pacific is vast and dark tonight. On a distant shore, a new colony is learning what it means to exist at the edge of the world. Good night. Good night.
(1890) Africa, a continent of enormous diversity, ancient kingdoms, complex trade, networks and hundreds of distinct peoples and languages. European presence on the continent is at this point largely limited to coastal trading posts and a few settled colonies at the southern tip. The interior is largely unknown to Europeans and largely governed by its own peoples. Within 20 years, almost the entire continent will be divided between European powers. The speed and completeness of this transformation is extraordinary. It is driven by a combination of technological advantage, commercial competition, nationalist rivalry between European states, and an ideology that presents the subjugation of Africa as a civilizing mission rather than a conquest. The technological gap is decisive. The development of the Maxim gun and early machine gun gives European forces a firepower advantage that African armies equipped with older weapons cannot match in open battle. Quinine makes it possible for Europeans to survive in the malarial interior of the continent. Steamboats allow penetration of river systems. The telegraph allows coordination across vast distances. The combination of these technologies makes the conquest of Africa possible in ways it was not a generation earlier. Britain's role in the scramble for Africa is central. It already holds the Cape Colony at the southern tip, acquired from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars, and has interests along the West African coast. The ambitions of Cecil Rhodes, a British businessman and politician in South Africa, shaped British expansion in the region more than any other single figure. He dreams of a continuous belt of British territory, from the Cape in the south to Cairo in the north, the Cape to Cairo Railway, and telegraph running through British-controlled land for the entire length of the continent. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 brings the European powers together to agree rules for the partition of Africa. Africa's own peoples are not represented. The conference produces the principle of effective occupation, meaning a European power must actually establish presence in a territory to claim it. This triggers a rush to plant flags, build forts, and sign treaties with local chiefs across the continent. The treaties signed with African rulers are often fraudulent or misunderstood. Chiefs who believe they are agreeing to trade relationships or limited protection find they have signed away sovereignty. The legal fictions constructed around these treaties are thin, but they serve their purpose in the European system. Britain acquires an enormous share of the continent. Egypt comes under British control.
In 1882, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, Rhodesia, and Nyasaland. The map of Africa is redrawn with rulers and pencils in European capitals, cutting across existing kingdoms, ethnic territories, and geographic realities with straight lines that will create political problems lasting into the 21st century. Rest now, Africa is ancient and vast tonight. Lines are being drawn across it in offices, far away by people who have never seen it. Good night. Good night.
South Africa, the southern tip of the continent that Britain has controlled since the early 19th century. But control of the Cape Colony is not the same as control of the entire region inland from the British coastal territories live the Boers. Descendants of Dutch settlers who arrived in the 17th century. They have their own language, Afrikaans their own culture, their own deeply held sense of identity and independence. When Britain takes the Cape Colony from the Dutch, the Boers find themselves under a government whose language, religion, and values differ from their own. When Britain abolishes slavery in 1833, many Boers who rely on enslaved labor pack their wagons and move north and east in what they call the Great Trek. They established two independent republics in the interior, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. For decades, these republics exist in an uneasy coexistence with British South Africa. Then in 1886, gold is discovered in the Transvaal, and in enormous quantities. The Witwatersrand goldfields are the richest ever found. Overnight, the Transvaal becomes one of the most valuable pieces of territory on Earth. British commercial interests, led by Cecil Rhodes and backed by London, want access to this wealth. The Boer government of Paul Kruger resists. The Jameson Raid of 1895 is Britain's first attempt to resolve the situation by force. A column of mounted men led by Leander Starr Jameson rides into the Transvaal, hoping to trigger an uprising by British settlers there. The raid fails completely. Jameson is captured. The episode damages British credibility and hardens Boer determination to resist. War breaks out in October 1899. Britain expects it to be over quickly. The Boer republics are small. Their armies are irregular forces of farmers on horseback. Britain has the largest empire in the world and a professional army. The war should last months. It lasts nearly 3 years. The Boers are exceptional fighters in their own terrain, using guerrilla tactics that conventional British military thinking is not prepared for. They know the land. They move fast, they pick targets and disappear. The British army wins the set-piece battles but cannot end the war. Britain's response to the guerrilla campaign is to adopt tactics that create lasting damage to its reputation. Farms are burned to deny the guerrillas food and shelter. The civilian population, Boer women and children, are gathered into concentration camps. The camps are badly managed and disease spreads rapidly. Around 8,000 Boer civilians die in them. The majority children, a similar number of Black Africans, whose experience in the war is often overlooked, also die in separate camps. The war ends in 1902 with a British victory, but it is a victory that has cost enormously in lives, money, and international reputation. Newspapers across Europe and in the United States have reported on the concentration
camps, the image of the empire as a civilizing force has been seriously damaged. Rest now. The Veld is quiet tonight. The war is over, but the questions it has raised about the empire and its methods will not go away. Good night. Good night.
(1900 to 1914). The British Empire at its greatest extent. A quarter of the world's land surface. A quarter of the world's population. An empire so large that the sun, as the saying goes, never sets on it. At any moment of any day, there is British territory somewhere in the world where it is daytime. The phrase captures something real about the scale of what Britain has built. The statistics are staggering. The empire covers 35 million square kilometers. It includes territories on every inhabited continent: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, large parts of Africa, colonies, and trading posts across the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. Its navy is larger than the next two navies. Combined, the pound sterling is the currency of international trade. London is the financial center of the world. What holds this together is the Royal Navy. Britain's strategic insight, developed over centuries, is that controlling the seas is more important than controlling territory. A navy that can move freely across every ocean, can project force anywhere in the world. It can protect trade routes. It can blockade enemies. It can supply distant colonies. The empire is essentially a maritime system, and the navy is its foundation. The ideology that justifies the empire in this period is a mixture of commercial interest, racial theory, and genuine, if paternalistic, belief in a civilizing mission. Rudyard Kipling's poem about the white man's burden, published in 1899, captures the self-image of empire. At its most explicit, the subjugated peoples of the world are presented as children who need British guidance and governance. To develop this ideology is used to justify what is in practice the extraction of resources and the suppression of self-determination. The reality on the ground is more varied than any single description captures. In some territories, British rule brings genuine development. The abolition of local practices that cause suffering. The establishment of legal systems that provide some protection. Educational institutions that produce generations of leaders who will eventually use their British education to argue for independence. In other territories, the experience is one of dispossession, exploitation, and cultural destruction. There is no single British Empire story. There are hundreds of stories, one for each territory and population that comes under British control. And within each territory, many more stories, depending on who you are, where you live, and when. The Edwardian era, the years of Edward, the Seventh Reign from 1901 to 1910, is often remembered as a golden afternoon, a period of confidence and prosperity for those at the top of British society. It is genuinely prosperous for the working classes of Britain's industrial cities. It is harder for the populations of the empire's territories. The picture varies enormously. But the confidence is real. Britain in 1910 is the center of the world's largest empire, the leading industrial and financial power, and the dominant naval force on every ocean. It does not seem possible that this could change dramatically, and quickly. It will. Rest now. The empire is at its height. Tonight, in offices from London to Delhi to Lagos, men are administering a quarter of the world's surface. The scale of it is almost impossible to comprehend.
Good night. Good night.
August 1914, Britain declares war on Germany. The immediate trigger is Germany's invasion of Belgium, whose neutrality Britain has guaranteed. The deeper causes involve the web of alliances, imperial rivalries, and nationalist tensions that have been building across Europe for decades within days of the declaration. The machinery of empire begins to mobilize on a scale that has never been seen before. The British Empire goes to war, not just Britain. The Empire Canada mobilizes. Immediately Australia and New Zealand follow South Africa. Despite the wounds of the Boer War still fresh, contributes forces India, which has no say in the declaration of war made in its name by the British government, sends over 1.5 million soldiers to fight on multiple fronts: the West Indies, East Africa, West Africa. From every corner of the empire, men are mobilized, shipped to distant theaters, and asked to die for a cause that is defined and directed from London. The scale of the commitment is extraordinary, and the cost is devastating. The Western Front in France and Belgium becomes a byword for industrial-scale killing. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 kills 60,000 British soldiers on its first day. The total British Empire dead over the 4 years of war is approximately 1 million, including wounded and missing. The casualties reach 3 million. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 leaves a particular mark on the empire. British planning sends Australia and New Zealand troops to assault the Gallipoli Peninsula in an attempt to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The campaign fails at enormous cost. The Anzacs, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps suffer casualties that are disproportionate to the size of their populations. The 25th of April 1915, the day of the landing, becomes Anzac Day, the most solemn commemoration in Australian and New Zealand national life. The campaign shapes the national identities of both countries in ways that push them toward greater independence from Britain. The war transforms the empire's finances. Britain enters the war as the world's largest creditor nation. It exits as a debtor, having spent enormous sums on the war effort and borrowed heavily from the United States. The economic foundations of imperial power are weakened in ways that will take decades to fully show. The war also produces promises that will prove impossible to keep in the Middle East. Britain makes commitments to Arab leaders who support the revolt against the Ottomans, suggesting independence for Arab peoples after the war. Simultaneously, the Balfour Declaration of 1917 expresses British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and the Sykes-Picot Agreement divides the Middle East between Britain and France regardless of either commitment. The contradictions embedded in these wartime promises shape the Middle East for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The war ends in November 1918. Britain and its allies have won. The German, Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires are dissolved. Britain acquires new territories in the Middle East and Africa as League of Nations mandates. The empire is at its greatest territorial extent, but it is also deeply wounded in ways that are not yet fully visible. Rest now. The war is over. The guns are silent on the Western Front for the first time in 4 years. An empire has given 1 million lives for this silence. Good night. Good night. India, After the First World War is a changed place. 1.5 million Indian soldiers have served the empire. Tens of thousands have died in France, in Mesopotamia, in East Africa, and in Gallipoli. They have seen the world. They have seen that the British are not invincible. They have fought alongside soldiers from across the empire and absorbed ideas about rights and self-determination that are circulating widely in the post-war world. They return home to a country that is asking harder questions about the terms of its relationship with Britain. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885 as a moderate forum for educated Indians to discuss governance, is becoming something more assertive. The movement for Indian self-rule, Swaraj, is growing. And into this movement in 1915 steps a man who will transform it entirely. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi returns to India from South Africa, where he has spent 20 years developing a form of political resistance he calls Satyagraha, truth force or soul force. It is a method of non-violent, non-cooperation, of refusing to participate in unjust systems, of accepting suffering without retaliation, and thereby exposing the moral bankruptcy of the oppressor. He has tested it against racial discrimination in South Africa. Now he brings it to India. The Amritsar massacre of April 1919 accelerates the movement's growth. A crowd of unarmed civilians gathered in a walled garden called Jallianwala Bagh is fired upon by British Indian Army troops under the command of General Reginald Dyer. The firing continues for approximately 10 minutes. Around 379 people are killed by the official count. Indian sources put the number higher, the wounded number over 1,000. There is no warning given and no exit provided. The massacre shocks India and divides Britain. Dyer is censured, but not prosecuted. For many Indians, including those who had previously supported working within the British system, Amritsar is the moment they decide that system cannot be reformed from within. Gandhi becomes the undisputed leader of the independence movement. His campaigns in the 1920s and 30s are remarkable in their creativity and their discipline. The non-cooperation movement asks Indians to return British honors, withdraw from British institutions, and refuse to buy British goods. The Salt March of 1930 sees Gandhi lead a 240-mile walk to the sea to make salt in defiance of the British salt monopoly. It is a perfectly chosen act of symbolic resistance that the world's press covers extensively. Britain responds with arrests, including Gandhi himself on multiple occasions, and with gradual constitutional concessions that give Indians more representation in government without full self-rule. The Government of India Act of 1935 is the most significant of these, providing for elected provincial governments while retaining ultimate British authority. It is not enough. The question is no longer whether India will become independent, but when and on what terms. The Second World War will accelerate the answer. Rest now. India is stirring tonight. A small man in a dhoti is changing the world, not with weapons, but with walking and with the refusal to be anything other than what he is. Good night. Good night. September 1939, Britain declares war on Germany for the second time in a generation. Once again, the empire mobilizes once again. Soldiers from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and the Caribbean are asked to fight and die in a war declared in their name by a government in London, in which they have no representation. The scale of the imperial contribution to the Second World War is enormous and is often underappreciated in accounts that focus primarily on Britain itself. India alone provides 2.5 million soldiers, the largest volunteer army in history. They fight in North Africa, in Italy, in Burma, and across the Middle East. Over 87,000 Indian soldiers, Australian and New Zealand forces, play crucial roles in the North Africa campaign and in the Pacific. Canadian forces are central to the Normandy invasion. But the war also reveals the empire's vulnerabilities in ways that prove fatal to its long-term survival. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 is perhaps the single most damaging event for the empire's prestige. Singapore is Britain's great fortress in the east, the linchpin of its Pacific defense when Japanese forces take it in just 1 week, capturing over 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops in the largest surrender in British military history. The idea of British invincibility in Asia is destroyed permanently. The Japanese advance across Southeast Asia demonstrates to millions of Asians living under European colonial rule that the Europeans can be defeated by an Asian power. The psychological impact of this on independence movements across the region is profound and lasting. The Bengal famine of 1943 causes the deaths of between 2 and 3 million people. In the Indian province of Bengal, the causes are complex, involving wartime disruption of food supplies, speculation, and administrative failures. The British wartime government's response is inadequate and delayed Winston Churchill's priorities lie elsewhere. The famine becomes a defining moment in Indian memory of British rule, an example of imperial indifference to Indian suffering at its most extreme. The Atlantic Charter of 1941, signed by Churchill and Roosevelt, includes a clause affirming the right of all peoples to choose their own form of government. Churchill insists it applies to peoples under German occupation, not to Britain's colonies. Roosevelt and the United States do not share this view. American pressure for the dismantling of the British Empire is consistent throughout the war and intensifies after it. Britain emerges from the war victorious, but exhausted and deeply indebted to the United States. Its economy is damaged, its finances stretched, and its political will for maintaining a global empire is weakening. The costs of empire, always present, are now more visible than its benefits. The end, when it comes, will come quickly. Rest now. The war is over. Britain has survived, but it is not the same Britain that entered it. The empire it leads is not the same empire either. Good night. Good night. February 1960, Cape Town, South Africa. Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, addresses the South African Parliament. He has been touring Africa, and what he has seen has convinced him that something fundamental is changing on the continent. He chooses his words carefully. The wind of change is blowing through this continent. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. The speech causes shock in South Africa, where the apartheid government is not interested in the winds of change, but as a description of what is happening across Africa and across the empire. It is precisely accurate. The process of decolonization has already begun before Macmillan speaks. India and Pakistan become independent in 1947, Burma and Ceylon in 1948. The Gold Coast, renamed Ghana, becomes the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah. Each independence creates momentum for the next. The 1960s are the decade in which the British Empire in Africa effectively ends. Nigeria in 1960, Sierra Leone and Tanzania in 1961, Uganda in 1963, Kenya in 1963, Zambia, Malawi and Malta in 1964, Gambia in 1965, Botswana and Lesotho in 1966. The list goes on. Year by year, the map of British Africa turns from pink to the colors of new national flags. The process is not uniform. Some transitions are managed relatively smoothly with negotiated independence and maintained economic relationships. Others are marked by violence. Kenya's path to independence runs through the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s, a guerrilla insurgency against British rule that is suppressed with methods including detention camps and systematic torture that the British government acknowledges only decades later. In Malaya, today's Malaysia, a communist insurgency called the Malayan Emergency runs from 1948 to 1960. Britain's response includes the forced resettlement of over 500,000 rural Chinese Malayans into controlled villages to cut them off from the insurgents. It is a counterinsurgency strategy that works militarily but raises profound questions about the methods used. The economics of empire are also changing. The post-war reconstruction of Britain's economy, the creation of the National Health Service and the welfare state absorbs resources and political attention. The cost of maintaining military presence across the empire is increasingly hard to justify to a British public focused on domestic priorities. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers that emerged from the Second World War, both oppose colonialism in their public positions. For different reasons, American opposition reflects its own anti-colonial founding mythology. Soviet opposition is ideological and serves its interests in encouraging instability in Western Alliance territory. Neither superpower wants to see the British Empire maintained. Rest now. The flags are coming down across Africa and Asia tonight. Something that took centuries to build is coming apart in a decade. Good night. Good night. (1947). The end of British rule in India is coming. The question is no longer whether, but how, and the how will prove to be one of the most painful and consequential decisions in the history of the 20th century. The Indian independence movement has two major political forces: the Indian National Congress, led by Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, seeks independence for a united India. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, argues that the Muslim minority, around 1/4 of India's population, cannot be safe in a Hindu-majority independent India and demands a separate Muslim state, Pakistan, the land of the pure. The argument between Congress and the Muslim League is not new. It has been running for decades. Britain has at various points encouraged the division between Hindu and Muslim political organizations as a way of managing Indian politics. The legacy of this policy, deliberate or not, is a subcontinent where communal identities have hardened into political positions that seem irreconcilable. Lord Mountbatten arrives as the last Viceroy of India in March 1947 with instructions to manage the transition to independence. He accelerates the timeline dramatically, moving the date of independence from June 1948 to August 1947. The reasons for this acceleration are debated. The consequences are clear. There is not enough time to plan the partition of a subcontinent with any care. Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who has never visited India, is given 5 weeks to draw the borders between India and the new state of Pakistan. He works from maps and census data. He has no time to visit the areas he is dividing. The lines he draws cut through villages, farms, rivers, and communities that have existed for generations without regard to any border. On the 14th and 15th of August, 1947, Pakistan and India become independent. What follows in the weeks and months after is one of the largest and most violent mass movements of people in history. Up to 17 million people are displaced, Muslims moving to Pakistan, Hindus and Sikhs moving to India, all fleeing the violence that erupts along the new borders. Between 200,000 and 2 million people are killed in communal massacres. The numbers are uncertain because the chaos is total. Gandhi, who has spent his life working for independence and for Hindu-Muslim unity, is devastated by the violence. He fasts to protest the killing. He moves through the most affected areas, trying to stop the massacres by the force of his presence. On the 30th of January 1948, he is assassinated in Delhi by a Hindu nationalist who blames him for being too sympathetic to Muslims. The Kashmir problem that begins in 1947 is still unresolved. Both India and Pakistan claim the territory. 3 wars have been fought over it. It remains one of the most dangerous unresolved disputes in the world, with both countries now possessing nuclear weapons. Rest now. The subcontinent is independent tonight. The price of that independence has been paid in ways that still cannot be fully accounted for. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night.
1956. Suez, the moment many historians identify as the point at which Britain's pretensions to great power status are definitively exposed. A canal, a crisis, and a humiliation that forces Britain to confront what it has become in the post-war world. The Suez Canal, built in Egypt in 1869, connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and is the vital artery of British imperial trade. Goods from India, Australia, and East Asia pass through it. It is owned by a company in which Britain holds the largest share. In July 1956, the Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes the canal. He announces that Egypt will take control of its own territory and use the canal revenues to fund the Aswan Dam. Britain and France, in secret coordination with Israel, plan a military response. Israel attacks Egypt. Britain and France issue ultimatums to both sides designed to justify their own military intervention. British and French paratroopers land at Port Said. The military operation is going as planned. Then the United States intervenes, not militarily, economically. The Eisenhower administration, furious at not being consulted and unwilling to be associated with what looks to the world like old-style colonial intervention, puts enormous financial pressure on Britain. It threatens to withhold support for the pound sterling. Britain is still deeply indebted from the Second World War and cannot afford a currency crisis.
Britain backs down, the troops are withdrawn. The canal remains Egyptian. The episode demonstrates beyond any remaining doubt that Britain cannot act as a major power without American support, and that American support is conditional. The era of independent British global power is over. The decolonization that follows through the 1960s and 70s is rapid. The Caribbean islands gain independence, one by one. East Africa, West Africa. The Pacific Islands, even the small territories that remain, raise complicated questions about sovereignty, nationality, and what it means to be British. Rhodesia presents a particular difficulty. The white minority government of Southern Rhodesia makes a unilateral declaration of independence in 1965 rather than accept British conditions for independence that would require movement toward majority rule. Britain applies sanctions, but does not use military force. The Rhodesian crisis drags on for 15 years until Zimbabwe achieves recognized independence in 1980 under Robert Mugabe after a guerrilla war. Hong Kong is the last significant piece of the empire leased from China in 1898. For 99 years it is returned to China. On the 1st of July 1997, the handover ceremony in the rain, with the British flag coming down and the Chinese flag going up, is watched by millions on television. Prince Charles is there. Chris Patten, the last governor, is there. The soldiers who have been in Hong Kong sail away on the royal yacht Britannia. The Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic remain British, defended in a brief but intense war in 1982 against an Argentine attempt to take them by force. Gibraltar, Bermuda, a scattering of small territories around the world still fly the British flag as British overseas territories. Rest now, the empire is gone. What remains is something smaller and more uncertain. Britain on its island, trying to understand what it is without the empire that defined it for 4 centuries. Good night. Good night.
The British Empire is over at its peak. It covered a quarter of the world's land, surface, and governed a quarter of its population. It lasted in various forms for roughly 4 centuries from the first settlements in the early 17th century to the handover of Hong Kong in 1997. No empire in history has governed so many people across so much territory for so long. The legacy is genuinely contested and the debate about it is ongoing and heated. This is appropriate. Something of this scale and duration does not have a simple legacy. It has many legacies operating in different directions simultaneously, affecting different peoples in different ways. The English language is perhaps the most visible single legacy. It is today the global language of business, science, diplomacy, and the internet. This is partly because of the empire which spread English to every continent, and partly because of American cultural and economic dominance in the 20th century. But the foundation was laid by the empire. Hundreds of millions of people who have never been to Britain communicate in a language shaped in a small island on the edge of Northern Europe. The legal and institutional legacy is significant in many former colonies. The common law tradition, parliamentary democracy, independent judiciary, civil service structures. These institutions function with varying degrees of effectiveness across the former empire. In some places they have provided the framework for stable
democratic governance. In others, they have been captured by elites or distorted beyond recognition. The institutions are tools. What matters is who uses them and how. The economic legacy is the most contested. The extractive nature of colonial economics drained wealth from the periphery to the center over centuries. India, which had one of the largest economies in the world before British colonization, emerges from empire as an impoverished country. Africa's artificial borders, drawn by Europeans with no understanding of or interest in the peoples they divided, create political problems that persist into the 21st century. The underdevelopment of many former colonies is not simply the result of internal factors. It is also the result of what the empire did and what it left behind. At the same time, the empire created connections, institutions, and infrastructure that some former colonies have built upon the Commonwealth of Nations, the voluntary association of former British territories. Includes 56 countries and nearly 2.5 billion people. It is not a political organization with binding authority, but it maintains relationships of trade, education, and cultural exchange that have value to many of its members. The human legacy is the most personal and the most painful. The descendants of enslaved people live across the Caribbean, the Americas, and Britain itself. The communities divided by partition in India and Pakistan carry wounds that have not healed across 3 generations. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the Maori of New Zealand, the indigenous peoples of Canada are still working through the consequences of colonization in their own lives and communities. In Britain itself, the empire has left a population that is diverse in ways that were not true a century ago. People from every corner of the former empire have come to Britain, bringing their languages, their foods, their faiths, and their cultures. The Britain of today is in significant part the creation of its imperial past. How Britain remembers the empire is an active and sometimes angry debate. Some emphasize the achievements, the infrastructure, the abolition of slavery, the legal institutions. Others emphasize the violence, the exploitation, and the racism that underpin the entire system. The most honest accounts hold both things at once. The empire was not simply good or simply bad. It was an enormous and complex historical phenomenon whose consequences are still being lived. The British Empire, 4 centuries of expansion, governance, extraction, connection, a quarter of the world's surface, hundreds of millions of lives, shaped and changed, and in some cases, ended by decisions made in a small island off the northwest coast of Europe. It is gone. Its consequences remain. Sleep now. The story is complete. Good night.